Right, I've got to do a strange thing, which is to start talking over the music. Hello, and welcome everybody to the Tortoise newsroom for this special live edition of the news meeting. My name's Giles Patel. I'll be doing a strange mixture of talking at you and reading from these notes, which a colleague has very kindly prepared. In a moment, I'll be inviting 3 journalists to the stage who are each going to tell me which story they think matters most. We're going to discuss each one, and then in the end, I'll decide what leads the news. So, without further ado, please welcome Tortoises. Claudia Williams, are they there? I think they're there around the corner. Come on, Claudia. Yeah, come on out. Tortoises, Mark and Andrew, and also especially Sonia Soda, chief leader writer and columnist from The Observer. Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Sonia, huge fan, can I just say?
Oh, that's
and I've
nice
always been an admirer of your work and deeply envious of your job title. I think chief leader writer and columnist for The Observer, it doesn't get better than that in terms of journalistic gigs, does it, really?
I mean, I do feel very, very lucky. The funny thing about it, though, is having a job title like chief leader writer is people mix it up all the time. So sometimes they'll call you chief writer, sometimes, just leader writer.
Or just leader.
Sometimes they just call you chief leader, and I'm like, do you know what? I'll take it.
Yeah.
But there is, the little secret we have is there is just only me who does leaders on staff, so I am chief leader writer of myself.
But you do talk about it with editors and colleagues.
Of course, that's right, yeah.
Okay, so it's been a busy time for news. I've been thinking today about inflation and sneak preview for tomorrow's Tortoise Sense Maker, the great African land snail. Did you know it was going to make an appearance? All right. But before we get started, I think we have a montage. Let's see what my colleagues think has been important.
A submersible vessel which takes people to see the wreck of the Titanic has gone missing in the Atlantic Ocean. There's a major search and rescue operation underway, with the race to find the vessel before oxygen runs out.
Have you considered stepping back from the SMP?
I've done nothing wrong, and that is the only thing I'm going to assert to me.
The fishing boat, crammed with migrants and asylum seekers, capsized off the southwest coast of Greece on Wednesday morning, leaving at least 78 people known dead, but many more missing.
Boris Johnson's already quit Parliament. He sent word out to his remaining supporters in Parliament to boycott the debate and the vote on the Privileges Committee report that condemned him as a repeated liar.
Ayes to the right, 354. The noes to the left, 7. Who are you?
Right, before we get into it, one other piece of housekeeping. We're going to go through the news meeting according to the normal format at roughly the normal speed, depending on how prolix our guests are. But then, because you've all been kind enough to turn up, we'll have some Q&A afterwards. It's an opportunity for you to weigh in on the stories that have already been raised, discussed, but also those that you think we've missed. So do please pitch in then. So let's get started. Thank you again for being here. And we're going to start with long stories short. I ask you to summarise in one sentence, or even less than one sentence, what your story is. Sonia, go.
So my story is the Vaper trail. Is vaping a public health lifesaver or the latest leaf out of the tobacco playbook?
Fragrant. Well, that depends, doesn't it? Mark.
Lost at sea.
Leaving it at that?
That's it. Short and snappy.
Yes. Plenty of that happening.
Mine
Claudia.
is the Home Office versus festivals.
Okay.
I know which camp I'm in. Out of those two, it's definitely not Camp Home Office.
All right. Now we'll get into it. Sonia, let's start with you. Tell us in a bit more detail about your story, vaping.
Sure. So the reason I'm interested in this is that there's new figures out in the last month that show that the proportion of children experimenting with vaping has gone up by 50% in just a year, which I think is really significant. We've seen 2 important interventions this month. The Prime Minister has weighed in and said that the government are thinking about how to regulate vaping differently to protect children. And the Royal College of Paediatricians have come out and say quite strongly, actually, that they think that the government needs to be doing more. And this is all happening against, I think, a really interesting public health backdrop. So you've got quite a lot of divergence going on. This vaping seems to be something that divides the public health community and also governments in terms of how to regulate it. So you've got the World Health Organization saying that neither vaping nor smoking is safe. You shouldn't really do either. And actually, there's no strong evidence to suggest that vaping is an effective way of giving up smoking. And the best way to give up smoking is through the government funding proper smoking cessation services. And you've got Public Health England saying, actually, vaping can be an effective way of giving up smoking. It's 95% safer than smoking, vaping, and that's quite a controversial claim. And then in terms of regulatory approaches, I would say that the UK isn't quite as lax as the United States, but it's pretty lax. So, you know, they can't, vaping companies can't advertise on TV or on social media. There's ways of getting around that. You see vapes emblazoned on football shirts, on the sides of buses. A lot of that marketing is aimed at children with flavours like bubblegum and candy floss. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got Australia, who in the last couple of months has said they're basically going to crack down on vaping. It's only going to be available on prescription vapes as smoking cessation devices. It's going to be in plain pharmaceutical packaging, so it's going to be much, much harder to get hold of. And they're doing that because they're really concerned about children. Both vaping and smoking rates are going up in Australia. So I think there's this really interesting question about why are we diverging? Why are different bits of the globe diverging? Why is the World Health Organization seem to have a different emphasis than Public Health England? And what role does money play in this? And who's right in it all? And I think it's quite a confusing landscape, actually, for, mums and dads, basically, who are we've heard from a lot of them in recent months, really, really worried about kids vaping. And actually, a lot of experts think that the data on children vaping is a big underestimate if you look at what's going on in schools, for example.
It's everywhere. Great, well, thank you. Let's start then with this country, PHE, Public Health England, public body, obviously. And you mentioned that stat. In their view, vaping is 90% safer than smoking.
95.
95%, forgive me. You said it was controversial. Why is that a controversial figure?
It's controversial because they made the claim based on a study that was actually done by a guy called David Nutt. He's very big in drugs policy, but he's also himself cuts a controversial figure.
By the way, I see your two competitors sort of swatting on their laptops. is that allowed?
I was fact-checking something.
Yeah, and there's a
You're fact-checking me.
No, not you. Me.
My goodness. This is a pro operation here at Tortoise. You get fact-checked in real time.
There's quite a boring, prosaic reason, which is it's quite hard to get your notes printed out here because you've not been able to print anything in Fora for about 6 months. Because
The glamour behind the scenes.
Fora's printers have been hacked by an unknown power, and we've not been able to print anything across the entire office network for ages. And so this is the result. Anyway,
I'm so sorry to have called you on that.
Sorry, Fora.
APPGs, you see, I came across the same number in my normal go-to research resource, the Daily Express, right, where they had a guest column written, I think, by 3 MPs from the APPG, mentioned that number, 95% less harmful than combustible tobacco.
It's such a euphemism, isn't it? Combustible tobacco.
But also, they're all members of this APPG, which I don't know, but as we've established in the Westminster Accounts Project, a lot of them are funded by industry. Do we know if that is the case with this one?
Yes, it has been funded by industry, and the Secretariat was run by the Vaping Industry Association between 2016 and 2020. I think they've taken a step back from it now because they realised how dodgy it looked. Right. But there are absolutely questions to be asked about the influence of the tobacco industry. So pretty much all the tobacco giants are heavily invested in vaping now. And about the research that's coming out about this, because there's this thing called the Tobacco Playbook, which is basically refers to how tobacco companies in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, basically just pushed this idea that the science is very uncertain and no one could really say how harmful smoking was, had massive damage. If you look today at the research studies around vaping, I think most experts would acknowledge that they definitely think it's likely to be less harmful than smoking, probably significantly less harmful. But if you look at the studies, studies where researchers have declared a conflict of interest because there is money from tobacco involved, funnily enough, those studies seem less likely to find that vaping is associated with even low-level harm.
One more technical question on flavoured vaping.
Mm-hmm.
Are jurisdictions like Australia particularly concerned about that because it appeals to kids because it's flavoured, or are flavoured vapes more dangerous? I mean, is there something about them that is more harmful than non-flavoured?
It's about marketing
okay.
and appeal to children. Yeah, absolutely. And they've got a massive issue with it in the US. So there's a brand called Juul, which is owned by Big Tobacco, and regulation is even laxer in the US in terms of how much nicotine can go into these products. And they're marketed, they've got creme brulee flavour, bubblegum, candy floss. Kids seem to love it. Kids over here love it too. And if we speak to lung doctors, they're really concerned about the impact of nicotine on children, which we don't really know. We don't know much about.
Right. I'm going to let you two cross-examine the witness in just a second, but I have two more questions.
Mm-hmm.
You said Juul's owned by Big Tobacco. Are there any headline stats that we can grab hold of that, as a guide to how much money Big Tobacco is already making from vaping?
So there is I don't know about profits. That's something that we'd have to look into as part of our investigation, I think. And I think we should be following the money in this. But there are certainly stats out there. So I think, for example, Philip Morris owns something like a quarter of the vaping market now. So it's huge. It's small in relation to smoking still, even though vaping is now a multi-billion-dollar global industry and it's gone up hugely in the last 5-6 years. But it's still small compared to smoking. But experts are concerned that essentially this is like vape washing. So it's a way for Big Tobacco, that there are, the World Health Organization has agreed with governments that, essentially to keep tobacco lobbyists out of the room for the last couple of decades. And experts are really concerned that this is basically a way for tobacco lobbyists to get back into the room because they can be like, well, we're actually all about vaping, which is about helping people stop smoking.
Yeah, I suppose their way of looking at it would be it's a bit like Dong, the Danish oil and natural gas company, which
I don't know about this.
Which obviously no, it doesn't.
Is there another one called Ding?
Well, Dong doesn't exist anymore precisely because it changed to become an entirely wind power company.
Right.
Orsted.
Yep.
And good for them, right?
Yep.
In a way. So you might, if you were old tobacco person, think, look, I'm doing my best. Anyway, so my last question was, you mentioned David Nutt. Do we know of an equivalent figure at the WHO who has the opposing view? Is there one person who we know has crafted the WHO's position on this?
So again, I think that will take more investigation. There are certainly big public health names who are very, very anti-vaping, both in the US and the UK, and that has been the subject of some controversy. So people have said about the US anti-vaping people that they're a lobby too.
Right.
And they've got so carried away by their there's actually one guy, I've forgotten his name, but he was very, very involved in uncovering the issues of Big Tobacco, and he's hugely well respected for it.
That's not David Nabarro, is it?
No,
okay,
it's not.
no.
It's somebody else. I can't remember their name. If I had better notes, I'd be able to.
You have very good notes.
I'd be able to tell you, but he actually said at one point that he thought that vaping was worse for you than smoking, and that was a really, really controversial statement. And he says he still stands by it in some ways. So it's really interesting. And I think it gets you into the very interesting territory of when the science isn't settled, scientists themselves can actually be pretty ideological. And I think we saw that with the pandemic. And I suspect this is another area where feelings run so high, even in the scientific community, that you sometimes get people taking quite polarising opposite views when perhaps the evidence is just not there for it.
Claudia, what do you think of this story?
I think it's really interesting. What I was actually checking on my laptop to look at, now that you've caught me, is that we did a really short Science Maker podcast about this a couple of months ago. And what I wanted to check was a comment that I remembered as you were talking about from a teacher, and I couldn't check it, so I think this is right. And they were basically saying that some of the kids that they teach are so addicted that they're kind of one of their biggest problems is kids leaving the classroom to go to the toilet to vape. But also you're hearing anecdotal stories about the first thing these kids do when they wake up is literally head off the pillow, vape, which I think is, horrifying and fascinating in equal measure. But I also think the kind of interest for me is this is purely anecdotally. But I have a lot of friends who have never smoked, who now vape. And from seeing what they're vaping, there's these trends. And so like a few months ago, there was Jules. Now there are the little square ones that are like multicoloured.
Yeah. What flavours are they vaping?
I don't know. Peach? There's always
like
a peach
rhubarb
one. Yeah. But like you can kind of, they're always a bit terrible. Not that I've tried them. But you can kind of see the trends in what people are using.
Are they getting stronger and stronger? And are there any of them moving to cigarettes?
None of them are moving to cigarettes, but a lot of them are moving to vaping from kind of being drunk and having a vape to vaping in breaks at work to being a vapor. And but what I suppose the point I'm trying to make with these different kinds of vapes that come into fashion is supporting the idea that this is a fashion. This is like a trends-based thing. This is something that is attractive. This is something that is like brightly coloured. It's easy to access, and I totally understand why it would be attractive for kids. I suppose my concern slightly about it as a story is whether it's a news story now as it is, or whether it's kind of like an issue for further investigation. Because I think as you pulled out that tension between Public Health England and the WHO is really interesting, but kind of leaves you slightly with, well, where do we land? I don't think we necessarily know right now. And the kind of following the money is immediately the kind of interesting thing for me. And it's also a very useful reminder not to vape.
Are you grabbed, Mark?
We've talked about vaping versus smoking in the newsroom. We've had think-ins on it, and I'm always struck. It's one of those ones that goes around in circles a bit. You get the people who are like, oh, it's a good way for people who are smoking to get off, and then the people say, well, actually, it's a gateway to smoking. And just while Sonia was pitching, I just had a quick look, and I didn't realise it was only about 3 weeks ago that the government closed a loophole which allowed vaping companies to give free samples to children.
Yes, that's right.
Basically, which I was quite alarmed by.
So until 3 weeks ago,
vaping companies could provide free samples
to children of any age?
I need to check that, but I think it was teenagers, something like 11 to 15. And I think it was, from what I can see, it seems to be done under the guise of, if you're thinking of smoking, why don't you do this instead? It's not as dangerous. If I had to pick something in it, it would be that this sort of like, is vaping bad and where is the money coming from? Because the tobacco industry has, as you rightly pointed out, about 8 decades of form of like having doctors going, oh no, cigarettes are great, they're really smooth, they help you breathe more easily and everything like that from the 50s, right? To more sort of darker sort of ways of choreographing money. So it's impossible to find out like how they're influencing any research projects. The thing for me that's interesting about vapes, and I think this is the thing that you will find most interesting about vapes, is the environmental and resource impact of them. And they contain lithium, they contain copper, and if you were to take all of the lithium out of the vapes just sold, the disposable vapes that were thrown away last year, that would make enough batteries of 2,500 electric cars in the UK.
Blimey.
That's a
And
good
I
start.
think the environmental one.
I feel like you're aping me here. Do you want to steal my pitch?
Well, what I'm going to say, well, I think the thing that would make it the lead would be to reframe the environmental one, because those sorts of stats, people care now about how much lithium there is or isn't and how much copper. The copper one actually, it could power 370,000 charging stations. The amount of copper that gets thrown away.
I'm going to resist. I do think the environmental aspect of this is really interesting, and I think you're right to bring it up, and I didn't have time to bring it into my pitch. And actually, one of the reasons why the government's talking about banning disposable vapes is A, because they're cheaper for children, super easy for them to get hold of, even though they're not supposed to be, but for environmental reasons. But I actually think this story has so much purchase with parents who are worried anyway, that I think we should be leading with the health consequences and the money and what's going on here rather than the environment. I think the environment is a very interesting angle that could come in, but I don't think it should be the lead.
It's a difficult one to argue against, isn't it?
Okay. Now, Mark, it's your turn. I'm going to get my phone so I can keep track of time. Because speaking of batteries, the battery on my Swatch ran out. Right.
That was 15 disposable vapes that have powered
Really?
your watch. Yeah.
What's your story, and tell us more about it?
So my story is that the 9 Egyptian men have been accused of causing the disaster last week, which saw a fishing vessel, the Adriana, which was it sank just off the Greek coast, carrying hundreds of people. Possibly up to something like 750 people have died on this, and they've just appeared in court and pleaded not guilty to the charges levelled against them of trafficking and other things. And the reason that I'm pitching this is because it draws attention to a collection of stories which build up to basically the West's response to what's going on with boats in the Mediterranean. Everyone is talking about the Titan submarine at the moment, and I can see why. I can see why the Titan thing works. It's total rolling news fodder. BBC are doing a 24-hour live blog on it. People are doing all sorts of things like diagrams of what the submarine looks like and where they might be sitting in the submarine and how much oxygen there is and how it's powered by a PlayStation controller. All of that, and I get it. But I think the coverage of that is disproportionate, not just to what happened with the Adriana at the end of last week, but at the same time that the submarine thing was happening, Alarm Phone, which is a service that picks up distress calls from people's mobile phones when they're run into trouble on these boats, picked up 29 distress calls from a ship in the middle of the Mediterranean, and the Maltese government instructed Maltese commercial vessels not to respond and not to help them. And I think...
And this was distress calls from a separate boat, not from the Adriana.
This is from the Adriana was at the end of last week.
Yeah.
This boat, I don't have the name of it, but it was it was basically essentially a large raft, but there were 29 people on it issuing distress calls, asking for help. They couldn't get any help. Commercial shipping was ignoring them. The Maltese government turned around and said, "Do not help this vessel." And that was happening at the same time that Canada, the US, the UK, France have managed to mobilise this huge rescue operation, not just for 5 wealthy guys trapped in what sounds like a death trap submarine in the Atlantic. And that's not to say that one set of lives is more valuable than another. But I do think that the two things that make this story interesting for me is, first of all, it highlights the chaotic nature of the European and Mediterranean countries' response to what's going on there. There are 21 countries that border the Mediterranean, and between them, they can't rescue a single ship with 29 people, or apparently 750 people on it. Mm-hmm. But 4 countries, 2 of which are on opposite sides of the Atlantic, can mobilise very quickly a rescue operation that generates headlines around the world to fix that. So I guess my pitch is, I think there needs to be greater coverage of the inadequacy of the European and general kind of Mediterranean country response to the migrant crisis that's happening there.
Okay. So the 9 men accused are accused of trafficking.
Yeah, so they're Egyptian men. The boat was largely full of Libyan and Pakistani passengers. the Libyan refugees are escaping instability in Libya from Pakistan. Well, there's the Pakistan financial crisis. There's all sorts of problems importing food. I'm not re-pitching the Adriana story, but there is lots in that story.
Right. And that's what I wanted to ask you about, because the other question is, you talk about the nature of the European response, in this case, Greek Coast Guard. Question raised in all the Sunday papers, including presumably yours. Forgive me, I was reading the Sunday Times coverage, but
We'll let you off.
shouldn't it be the Coast Guards who allegedly attached a rope to the boat and then pulled it in different directions until it fell over?
So that's before you get to that point, there are differing accounts. So the Adriana supposedly, according to the Coast Guard version of events, the Greek Coast Guard version, they said that they repeatedly offered help on, I think, 3 or 4 occasions, and each time the ship said, no, we're fine. And then on the last occasion, they asked for food and water. Then the Greek Coast Guard version is that they saw the ship steering erratically, making 90-degree turns. It was overtaken by a wave, and that's where it started to run into trouble. The BBC has since done an investigation, and they have managed to show that the Adriana didn't move for about something like 7 or 8 hours. It was completely stationary, which kind of throws some doubt on the Greek version of events. And then there is this other sort of element to the story, which is at some point the Greek Coast Guard have gone in, they've tried to rescue the boat, they've attached a rope to it, they've tried to tow it to somewhere safer, and in the action of towing it, they've caused the boat to capsize and sink and cause a huge loss of life, compounded by the fact that there was issues of people locked below deck. There's a story that a lot of the women and children were locked below deck, a lot of the Pakistani passengers were locked below deck to keep the groups of people separate, and that's led to the huge loss of life. But you have to work quite hard to find a lot of this stuff in one place and explained quite clearly. And I think that there is a bit of a failure that needs redressing in how these things are reported. If I can find out the name of the guy who cancelled his trip on the Titan submarine, and if I can read the last text message that the other guy sent before he went on it, and if I can hear about the employment history of various engineers who used to work at the company that owned Titan who were fired because they raised concerns, if I can know all of that, why can't I find out clearly what's gone on in the Mediterranean and about just this chaos of a humanitarian crisis that no one sort of seems ready to or willing to kind of get stuck into and understand really what's going on? And the last bit I would say for it is that already what you can see is that all the governments involved in the Med crisis, the Greeks and the Maltese in particular, are doing the standard playbook, which is where they just point at the people traffickers and they go, well, it's them. I mean, it's totally down to them, and what can we do? Because they're the ones at the root of all evil of this. And they clearly do have a huge part to play, but it's a massive deflection technique, because then everyone starts talking about people traffickers and no one talks about the fact that one country ordered its commercial shipping vessels not to help a boat in distress for 2 days.
Great, thank you. So a huge amount of uncertainty, which we're not going to resolve here, but nonetheless, a staggering number of people known to have died. I mean, you said up to 750. We've seen the pictures. Sonia, what to you about this story is most compelling and important? Is it the tragedy of the boat itself? Is it the bigger picture, the confusion that Mark talks about? Where would you go with it next?
For me, I think it's a failure. So unlike with the Titan, where it's very complex and actually it does feel a bit like stabbing at the dark in terms of saving these 5 lives of the people who are on this submarine, the Adriana feels like something that shouldn't have happened. And I think that that's something that's very common to the tragedies we see in the Mediterranean. So for me, it's really a kind of... it's a question about failings that mean that people are left to die when they shouldn't be, when it's entirely preventable. And I think the Adriana disaster has that in common with things that we've seen before. I think that actually Mediterranean crossings have sort of slipped down. I mean, I remember back in 2017, 2018, it was a major news story every summer. We saw the death of that tiny toddler, Turkish toddler, that was really absolutely dreadful. And that really kind of brought a lot of media attention to what was going on in the Mediterranean. But it really feels like it slipped down the agenda. And so for me, it's a why. I guess my one concern about the way that Mark has packaged it up is that I've seen a lot on Twitter, a lot of tweets about, it's just terrible. No one cares about deaths in the Mediterranean. There's not enough news coverage of them. And, we're all like looking hooked at what's going on with the submarine rescue. And so my concern would be is it just feels like it's maybe taking that discourse from Twitter and applying it to what is a really important story, which I think maybe could feel a little bit off-putting because I'm quite hooked on the submarine story as well, and I really want these people to be rescued. But that doesn't mean that I think it's more important than what's going on in the Mediterranean. So I just wonder if maybe some of our readers might feel a bit judged.
Yeah, so I was careful trying to not make it sound like come across as glib, and I think what the comparison allows you to do though is show what can be done if the countries involved. Like, it's possible.
Yes.
It shows it's possible. If you can mobilise 4 enormous ships, like there's that hyperbaric thing coming from Canada, there's the French, because they've got the biggest winch in the world or something that could reach down there. And, all of this stuff, it just proves it can happen. And it throws more light, I think, onto the question is why can't it happen right on our doorstep? If we can make it happen in the middle of the Atlantic in some of the roughest seas, surely we can stop it happening there.
Do you think that that's just... Sorry.
No, go ahead.
But do you think that that's just countries showing off? Like, I feel it's a bit like, obviously France has got a citizen on board, but I feel like there's also a bit of Macron saying, here's our massive capability, our little robot that can...
What happens? Come on, with every earthquake, everybody sends. I was supposed to be in Moscow. I was in London when the Kursk went down. If people are old enough to remember the submarine, everybody sent. The British had a submersible. That was over in the Barents Sea before you know it. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
But when you've got European countries though going...
No, I interrupted you.
When you've got a European country going, well, it's on their doors going, no, do not help these people.
Right,
I think
okay.
that's the moment where I was like, oh, hang on, okay, so there is a judgment call that is made in the sort of government department. Someone will go, we'll do that one, but we're not going to do that one. And that, I think, is worth going to inquiry.
Claudia, let's come back to the Adriana specifically. Mm-hmm. We're nearly 10 days on. Is there an aspect of that story that you think should be leading the news tonight?
Tonight, I would say that it's the decision, for me, the thing that I'm the most interested in still now, 10 or so days later, is that decision to attach a rope and pull, and the difference between what happened depending on which side.
And finding out what happened, right?
And so for me, I think that's the. Yeah. I think it's such a hard thing because this is I would say the migrant crisis is undoubtedly one of the biggest stories of a generation. You can't really quantify it in terms of a week because it's a problem that keeps happening and we don't have any way of solving it at the moment, apparently. It keeps getting worse and we keep hearing these stories, and that's a real problem for journalists, I think, because it's the challenge of reporting on a tragedy that is going to happen again and keeps happening. And how do you do that in a way which honours the victims that have died in that moment, on that day, and at the same time in the knowledge that it might happen again in however many days, and keeping that interest of readers? It's a horrible situation to happen. And I think it made sense that last week, one of the stories that went viral, one of the current images or videos that went viral, was that those 2 brothers through bars, meeting each other and finding each other, because that people can hook onto that. That's a story that I can imagine. That's a brother that, I can picture that. 750 people is unimaginably horrible. And I do think that's where, journalism falls down actually, is our ability to keep telling stories with the power that they need when they do keep repeating themselves. But I think that's where investigative journalism comes in, right? Because if I was going to go on with this particular story, you'd want to do the recreation of what happened, and based on everything that we know, and that's not a quick story to do. You don't get the answer for that this week. That's something that you have to stick with for weeks and weeks and weeks, months, years, to actually look at the satellite, look at the different things, speak to as many people as you can. But the problem is, actually, this, if we're looking at this is 750 people, and that's terrible, but it's it's already going to happen again. And how do you approach that for every one of these disasters?
Totally, but you say that, but already this week I've seen computer modelling of like how that submarine in the Atlantic has gone down here, gone down there, the trouble it couldn't run into, like all that modelling and investigation stuff you're talking about. Admittedly, it's all speculative because they're working with limited data, but things can move when they need to move.
The people engaged, have power. The people involved have power, but also like the organisation itself that's kind of responsible for this want answers too. So it's kind of an access information issue as well as like whose finances are involved.
I think it's because people can more easily imagine themselves as being really wealthy and paying a lot of money to do something extremely exciting, like go and see the Titanic, than they can. It's very painful for people, I imagine, to imagine themselves as somebody so desperate to escape conflict and poverty that you're going to risk your life. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't want to tip my hand, but I'm kind of with you on the and part of it. The media is big enough, given the will, to cover lots of different stories in lots of different ways, and some lend themselves to being covered in some ways and others. Claudia, let's move on. What's your story? Or tell us more about it anyway.
A slight change of pace. So none of us are at Glastonbury, apparently. I thought I'd really rub it in for all of us by talking about music festivals.
Were you meant to be at Glastonbury?
Yes, I was. Let's not talk about it.
What happened? Why
It's
are
a
you
really
there?
good story.
My godchild is being christened this weekend.
Oh, how lovely.
And I don't know if this is being recorded, but he now knows. Freddie, I'll be there.
Well, once again, and can't you do... Anyway, come on.
I checked, there's no trains. So this is a story that was originally published by The Guardian. And it's about how the government made a very last-minute U-turn on drugs testing at music festivals just before what is essentially the busiest time of the year for music festivals and for music festival organisers. And now, obviously, it is illegal to take drugs. It's illegal to take drugs at music festivals. That doesn't change, but we know it happens. And it happens more at music festivals than it does at other kind of events. And for nearly a decade, a lot of the UK's kind of most popular and busiest live music festivals have done something called back of house drug testing. And basically what that means is that they still search people for drugs, they still remove their drugs from them, but once they've confiscated them, they test them, and they test them to kind of work out what's actually in them and how dangerous they are. And if they find something that is really dangerous, if they find like a pill that could kill you, or something that says that it's one thing and actually contains something really harmful, they send out like a text alert to people so that they know not to take that substance, and they also kind of advertise it around the music festival. And that's been happening for a while, and it's very different to the kind of amnesty style, come, we'll test your drugs for you and then tell you if they're okay. This is like, these items have been confiscated, and it's just kind of a public health warning. And the point of it is it's about harm prevention, and the aim is to reduce the number of people who die at music festivals, which are dangerous and are kind of particularly dangerous for young people. They're particularly dangerous in the UK. We have a really high rate of kind of drugs deaths compared to the rest of Europe. And it's hard to find exact numbers, but between 2017 and 2018, 11 young people, and they do specify young people in the data, and I tried to find out a bigger number and I couldn't find it, so just 11 young people died between 2017 and 2018 just at music festivals, and 13 were kind of taken to hospital with serious problems. And the evidence shows that this kind of testing helps. It reduces the kind of generalized drug harm. It doesn't encourage more drug use. It actually encourages people to throw away their drugs because they've seen, oh God, that's dangerous, I've bought that, I'm going to throw that away. And it kind of happens in collaboration with the police, local authorities, and the Home Office, until last week, when the Home Office, just before Parklife, which is a massive music festival in Manchester, got in touch with the kind of charity that runs this testing for Parklife and said, you're going to need a license to do that. And that is a license that takes 3 months to get. And they obviously couldn't get in time for this music festival. And so it meant that for the first time in nearly a decade at this music festival, Parklife, which is attended by kind of 80,000 people and on the drug scale is seen as kind of a high risk for people taking drugs, essentially. They didn't have any of this testing for the first time in ages. And it's unclear, essentially, what's going to happen for the rest of summer when we're just hitting the peak season for festivals, because these organisations haven't been left with enough time to provide the alternatives that they say they need for the kind of welfare of the 5 million people that attend music festivals in the UK.
Who's responsible? Is it Suella or is it somebody else at the Home Office? Do we know?
We don't know. We don't know. And I think that's part of the reason why this is interesting and also important, because this is a policy that has been growing in popularity, that's kind of been building pace. It's got buy-in from a lot of different people. It's got buy-in from local organisations. In 2018, the Home Office said, you know what, you guys make local decisions. We're not going to get involved in this. The kind of prospect of needing a licence isn't new. So you have always you've always needed a licence for this kind of testing, but it's never been enforced. And because there's so much buy-in, there's this is organised with the police, this is organised with local councils, it's never been enforced. And so this is a clear shift. And I suppose the two options, right, which is that it's this kind of thoughtless, accidental, low down, white paper that's kind of accidentally made a splash, in which case it's hugely reckless and is going to have an outsized impact over a summer, or it's something purposeful. It comes from the top, and you can see it as part of a kind of slow creep towards, tougher laws on drugs. You can also kind of see it as this very kind of punchily timed U-turn, which is just before the moment that it's going to have the biggest impact, which doesn't leave anyone time to provide alternatives, which means you are effectively getting rid of drugs testing. So you could see it as a U-turn away from testing in general.
Right.
And that's something that, in 2021, the DCMS, the DCMS in a select committee report said, we strongly back this testing. We think it's great. We think it works. There is evidence to show that it works. We think that actually this needs to be formalised and made easier. So I think either way, whether it's kind of a lower down decision that's accidental or a kind of higher up one that you can see as part of a kind of slide towards tough on crime, it's having an impact.
Okay, two very quick questions. In future years, if everybody knew that they needed to get a licence 3 months ahead of time, would that be enough?
Probably not, because the type of licence that it is, you need to get, so first of all, it takes time. So yeah, you've got enough time to do it. But
we should ask Liz, actually.
Yeah, we'll go next year. For most of these licenses, it needs to be a clearly defined area that someone can go and check however many weeks in advance. And that is just not possible for a music festival where the tents are put up, taken down within a period of weeks. It's not something that you can plan in advance. And it's also something that moves around a lot. It's something that has to be reactive. And it does seem to be that this is the type of thing which is stopping it via red tape rather than outright stopping it.
Go on.
Sorry, I should say that as far as I know, and I think this is an interesting part of it, that I tried to get clarification from Glastonbury about what they're going to be doing.
Yeah.
And they said they still will be testing, and they were very they answered me very quickly about, they're still testing, they've tested for ages, but they didn't come back to me on clarification about whether that's because they have a separate kind of license, whether that's because they will be breaking this order,
right,
or whether it's because, for an unknown reason that I don't know, whether they have a kind of, they've got an exemption or they were told in advance or anything like that. But it's worth saying that, kind of Parklife, Reading, Creamfields, all these organisers are very, they're pushing for a judicial review. Okay. And they've essentially said, and it's punchy, but they've said that the government is playing politics with children's lives. That's kind of the line they've taken.
So this story makes me feel a complete grandad because my drug taking and my festival going leaves a great deal to be desired. But Sonia, isn't there something a bit strange about a situation in which you've got the police, whose job is to enforce the law, effectively collaborating in a scheme that allows people to break the law on drugs?
No, I sort of think that is okay, actually. I think, I'm sure lots of people have watched The Wire and watched the series where the police actually did sort of, you know, they have kind of like low enforcement zones, or no, what do they call it? Amsterdam, yeah. So no, I think that's okay. I guess my question about this story, like the big question, so did you say it's a charity doing the testing?
So there's private organisations. One of the main ones is a charity that has only recently.
Yeah, see, I just think it's really weird that you've got government regulations around licensing that effectively aren't being followed. I think on two counts. First of all, if it's a charity, like I sit on charity trustee boards, like I would not be happy if my charity was doing stuff outside of legal guidance. So I think that's a question. And then if it's private companies, again, you should really be, unless there's a really good reason not to follow the regulation. And it sounds like there may be, which is that it can't practically be followed.
And I think it's that the regulation hasn't caught up with the kind of public policy base.
Right, I see.
And that the DCMS Select Committee report did push, they urged the government to update the licensing rules to fit with what the evidence shows and what has kind of been practically happening.
Yeah.
And that's not happening.
So I'm interested in that, but I'm finding it hard to believe that it's a case of sort of tacitly changing the government's approach on drugs. I guess because also what government wants to be responsible for a change in something that leads to such significant harm that you see young people potentially lose their lives at festivals. So I think it's really interesting. I think it's really under the radar. It's not something that I'd heard of before today. Which shows you how well I read my own paper. Yeah. But to me, it just has a feel of a cock-up rather than conspiracy, which I think makes it interesting, but a little bit less interesting than if it's a political conspiracy.
Nice binary choice. Which of those do you go for, Mark? Cock-up or conspiracy?
Probably cock-up.
And how big a story?
On its own, not huge, but the cock-up element of it for me that I think is more interesting is that it's another example about how drug policy is, I don't know, I would say 10 to 15 years behind of the scene that it's trying to police and regulate. So the main danger for drugs, frankly, when you're buying them, I hear, is that not that, oh, I've bought this and it's turned out to be something else. It's that I've bought this and it's really fucking strong. So if a pill is 5 times stronger than you expect it to be, or if the MDMA is found to be twice as strong as it is, and this is what a lot of this testing uncovers, that's when, you know, it speaks to this idea now that the purity of drugs has skyrocketed, the price has plummeted, and the regulations we have now are not they're still doing the whole sort of possession, and it's a really outdated approach to it, when actually what it's hiding is the fact that the drugs now that people are taking and have access to are actually quite different to the ones that they used to have access to. And a lot of the things that are kind of category B and C should probably be regraded to be more dangerous than they actually are, because a pill now contains enough MDMA to fell an elephant.
That's so interesting, because I'd heard about this in relation to like marijuana, so it's getting like a lot stronger than it used to be. But I just don't because I would have thought, my perception would be that the main risk would be that it's cut with other things, rather than, because surely, how does making it purer work economically?
Because it's the rival gangs and cartels are basically competing on quality, basically, and there's the financial benefit of cutting cocaine. Yeah, the financial benefit of cutting cocaine with I don't know, creatine or household bleach, you might as well just put cocaine in it, because the supply is so plentiful, and the competition between the Albanian drug gangs that control Southeast. This is slightly different from like the Metro front pages of about 20 years ago, where they used to go, oh, you can get a bag of ketamine in Cleethorpes for 50p. Like, this is the state of.
It's so good that you've gone away and done all this research.
Just to kind of a lot of it is about strength. So we're talking about teenagers who buy something and die because they don't realise actually what they're taking is like 5 times the amount of what they should take. And these kind of alerts and the information that comes out of this testing, first of all, this is seized by the police, it's taken. So they're not actually condoning it, we're saying we've taken this away, and then it's information sharing.
Yeah.
and saying, actually, you know what, this little pill that's shaped like a butterfly and looks like this is incredibly dangerous. Do not take that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, look, we've all done a lot of talking. I want to leave some time for everybody else to do some talking. The stories are a government U-turn on drugs testing policy at festivals, crafty and spiteful and deliberate, or cock up. That's story number one. Next to you, the 9 men arraigned on charges of trafficking in relation to the sinking of the Adriana, on which up to 750 people died, or a divergence of opinion on the merits or otherwise of vaping, as between WHO on one hand and PHE, Public Health England, on the other. So, Claudia, you cannot pick your own story. Which would you choose to lead?
I think I would choose Mark's story.
I've always liked you.
Would you like me to explain?
Very
why?
briefly, in a line.
Because I think that I hadn't heard at all about the ship that you mentioned this week. And I also just think that the migrant crisis and the way that journalists cover it is something that we need to keep working on and thinking about. And the kind of investigation into what happens next is the bit of this story that I think risks being ignored. And if we stay on that this week after it happened, that's important.
Okay, Mark, you can't choose your own. Which one would you choose?
It's not a desk thing, but I'm going to go with Claudia because I used to take a lot of drugs, in a previous life, and I have a vested interest in what's going on. Thanks.
Chatham House rules.
It's not the reason I expected, but thanks.
Yeah, no, I'm just going to be honest with it, basically. Yeah, I'm curious to see what the market's up to. Yeah.
And what people are doing to keep you alive.
Yeah.
Great. Sonia.
So I feel like Mark rather undermined himself here because I preferred his pitch of Claudia's story to Claudia's pitch. So I would go for Claudia's story, but I'm not that interested in whether it's cock up or conspiracy because I think it probably is a cock up. I'm much more interested in this idea that drugs are getting more dangerous because they're getting stronger, which I didn't really know about. And I'm interested in this story as part of that and part of how we're getting regulation wrong into that. So I'm both of you have shunned me, but I'm I'm giving a bit to both of you because, I think it's Claudia's story, but with Mark's pitch on top.
It's a dream team.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to wrap up very briefly. Sonia, it would be ungracious of me to rank your story for 2 reasons. One is that you've come all this way, and the other is that it's a feature story without a very clear answer to the why now question. So you mentioned 2 new sets of data or research, but they're not right now. So for that reason, I wouldn't have it leading the news. I do think it's a double-page spread in your paper. I do think it's fascinating to follow the money in vaping. And thirdly, I think there are scientific questions to be resolved about the health effects of being addicted to nicotine, even if you're not absorbing combustible tobacco. So I'm with you on all the points of interest there, and if you wrote it up brilliantly, as I'm sure you would, it would probably start on page 1 and then go to pages 12 and 13. Yeah? Claudia, I think that your story would make the front or the top of the bulletin tragically after the next death of a child at a festival. And then people would be scrambling to find, to apportion accountability. For that reason, it's an important story already. For that reason, it's a good scoop by The Guardian. I wouldn't have it leading. I would have Mark's story leading with this caveat. I don't think this story is about, to your point, Sonia, the admittedly grotesque contrast between the coverage given to the Titan and the lack of coverage, relatively speaking, given to all migrant tragedies in the Mediterranean. If you don't see why we're all hooked on the Titan story, I think you don't understand human nature, never mind the media. That is a real-time unfolding story. And it's completely irresistible. And we're probably the only newsroom in the world not assigning multiple people to it because we call ourselves slow. We give ourselves that exemption, as it were. Otherwise, it would be professional negligence not to be all over it all the time. I mean, raise your hands. Am I the only person who, whenever I see a notification on my phone, I look at it because I think if it's AP or Reuters or BBC, maybe they found them. Yeah? I'm not alone in that. I don't think it's pure prurient. Anyway, but I do think, to your point, Claudia, the way to do the story of the dead is to do expensive, old-fashioned, long-term reporting and go, and that is how the New York Times would do it, and it's by getting at the detail that you cover it, but it still leads.
Oh, so I've won.
You've won.
Yeah, brilliant. I'll take that, the technicality. Thank you. Yeah.
So
It was with some.
Yeah.
yeah, there's a caveat.
I always win
some
like that.
caveats,
It's,
yeah,
it's
It
fine.
was like the brute force of the story makes you win. I'm giving you
Cheetah's charter.
It's fine.
still a win. B+ for the pitch. Pocket the win. Right. So that is the result today. Mark St Andrew wins. Second equal for Sonia and Claudia, if that's
very
allowed.
nice.
And that is the end of formal proceedings. Thank you very much to the three of you. But tell us, please, if we still have a few minutes, and we have three, what you would have put at the top of the news and what we've missed.
Do people agree with the order?
Yes.
Okay. Good to know.
There's not... Liz?
I don't have anything hugely important to say other than Philip Morris Tobacco now categorises itself as a health tech company. Interesting positioning for them.
CEO, he's doing ads, isn't he? They keep appearing on.
Very bullish.
Yeah.
Looking at there are PR manoeuvres, for sure. And the second thing is, speaking as the country's principal commentator on what, definitive commentator, I would say, on what is and isn't cool. Smoking was always cool. Vaping never has been. It's so embarrassing and awful, and we should only ever refer to people who vape as vapists. And that is my anti-marketing strategy to kill this fucking thing dead. I think it's a disgrace purely on the basis that I'm ashamed for anyone who does it.
Thank you so much, Liz.
Watermelon and things like that. It's just awful.
Okay, is there anybody else who wants to mention a story that we've missed? Yes?
Yeah, hi. I have a vested interest in this because I work in film and TV. But obviously we have the writers' strikes and the actors striking in America. But something we're not talking about, the oil industry in the UK is now at the standstill. We haven't worked in like 6 months. And now the BA5 put in resources as well because it was a reason. But what is really interesting, it's the one industry or one off that always been sort of on the rise in the last 10 years, and why the UK government not doing more to support the people here, and what does it say about their plan for the economy, because they're now trying to shut down like studios and not helping the union to retain the worker in that economy, and that affects everyone because you will have nothing left on Netflix, sorry. But also all the workers are now moving away from the industry, so that there is a massive shift happening in industry that's like under the blanket that no one really pays attention about, unless if it's Me Too, but actually is really important, I think, to talk about for the economy and just UK in general.
So you think the UK government should be doing more for the creative industry at this time while the strike is going on?
Yeah, I think, well, you could talk, I'm French, obviously. You have, if you look at other countries and how they help people in the creative industry to sort of still have something to work or like some sort of salary when they're not working. But most importantly, at the moment, they're sort of cutting tax breaks. Yeah, it's debatable. But most importantly, they're sort of cutting a lot of the tax breaks and trying to shut down a lot of the studios, which in the last 10 years have attracted all of the business from the States. And now everything is going to East Europe. And it's like, why are we doing this at a time where we have inflation, at a time where we have employment problem? When all of the business is coming from there, why are we cutting the grass under our own feet, basically?
Okay, thank you. Yes?
Mine's just in addition to that, to add theatre into it. So over the last 5 years, there was a power grab that a lot of set designers, lighting designers moved from, say, National Theatre to Netflix because they followed the money. And now, if they're not working, we're now missing, well, those people are now not working both in the theatrical world and film and TV. Just that to you.
And there was one more.
Yeah, the visit of Blinken to China this week, and I think it's the first visit in 5 years that from a Secretary of State to China, most important trading relationship in the world. It's also probably the most important relationship more broadly, and what exactly happened, what was talked about, what was uncovered, and trying to sort of illustrate the silver lining of what has been a tense relationship for the past several years, and how can we sort of like build upon those to avoid Thucydides' trap, which everyone talks about. And
the Thucydides trap. Yeah.
So like basically like China and the United States ultimately, basically when you have a rising power as China and then a declining power, there's this argument that there will inevitably be a war which will break out. That's sort of the argument. Which
I see. Okay.
And what are the sort of potential silver linings, or what are the things that came out of this discussion which we can find of ways to build upon the important relationship that exists?
Okay, great, thank you. So in addition to what we discussed, ban Vapists, that's a polemic for the leader column. Sonia can write it. Actually, you could write it very nicely. More government help for film and theatre in this country, and the visit of Blinken to China, which did lead the news at Tortoise yesterday. I agree with you, very important. The other thing's more in the middle of the book. I'm going to do this properly since this is my first time in this role. I'm going to read from the sheet. That's it. For the news meeting live, thank you to Sonia, Claudia and Mark, and to you for being here. If you enjoyed this live edition, you can listen to regular episodes every Friday on the new Tortoise app, which works, and we'll be back with another live version next month. Go to tortoisemedia.com to book tickets, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.